Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to AEI. Thanks for being here. I'd like to welcome all of you to AEI for what I think will be a really great discussion about a new and engaging book. My name's Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here, and for those of you watching from home or at your desk, welcome to this discussion as well. The book we're here to focus on and the discussion centers on a recent book by AEI visiting scholar Jay Cost, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. Jay argues in this book that a tug of war exists at the heart of the American project, a tug of war between the nationalism on Hamilton's side and republicanism on Madison's side, and that these are essential to understanding not only the past in which they lived, but the present day as well, and we'll get into that in the discussion. Jay's a visiting scholar here at AEI and is known to many of you as well as a columnist at National Review and in his hometown paper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, also a contributing editor at the Weekly Standard. His previous books are Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of Political Corruption, and also Spoiled Rotten, How the Politics of Patronage Corrupted the Once Noble Democratic Party and Now Threatens the American Republic. So we'll look forward. I'll hand this over to Jay in a moment, but I'd like to introduce his discussants, our panelists here today, one of whom is on his way in. He's delayed and will be here in a few minutes, and I'll introduce him in a second. But first, to Jay's right is Steve Knott. He's a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And prior to his appointment there, he co-chaired the presidential oral history program at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. His books include Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth and Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, the titles of which give you a sense as to why he's with us here today. Not with us, but soon to be with us, is Luke Thompson, the Vice President of Public Affairs at Apple Cart. He's supervised strategy, messaging, and targeting in dozens of state and federal campaigns nationwide, and has directed numerous advocacy efforts. Before that, he was the Director of Analytics at the National Republican Senatorial Committee and Chief Empiricist at Right to Rise. He is also a co-host of Constitutionally Speaking, a podcast that he shares with Jay, which you can find on Ricochet. It comes out just about every week. Is that right?
Yeah, we try.
Yeah, that's right.
It's hard.
Very good. So we'll just let Luke wander on up to stage when he gets here, but without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Jay so he can tell you a little bit about the book to get the discussion kicked off. So please join me in welcoming Jay and our panelists today.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction, and thanks for hosting this. Thanks to AEI. Thank you for all of you for being here. And if you could all do me a favor afterwards during the reception, if you could make oblique references to Luke about how we were all laughing at him when he wasn't here, so that way I want him to feel as guilty as possible for running late. Because he's also my co-conspirator on my podcast, Constitutionally Speaking. So we have a rapport. So if you could help me out, I'd appreciate it. I wanted to start by talking about why I wrote this book. And it seems nowadays that one of the strategies if you're looking to write a book about the Founding Fathers is you take two random Founding Fathers, you have a dartboard and you throw a dart, and whichever name it hits, you write a book about him, and then another dart and write a book about him, so then you end up writing like Thomas Paine and Edmund Randolph, this story that hasn't been told before, right? That's not why I did this, although I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of my motivation. But I think that Hamilton and Madison have had, through the years, what I would say is an underappreciated relationship. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was only relatively recently, I think, that the two of them were fully appreciated in their own rights as being real titans of the founding. Right? Madison was often sort of written off as Jefferson's lieutenant for various reasons. Some of them are good reasons, but a lot of times his own unique contributions were overlooked. And then Hamilton, unfortunately, and Steve can talk at length about this, is that Hamilton's reputation sank to a very, very low depth in the years after his demise. So much so that it was Hamilton's own son who basically, at the behest of his mother, took to writing a biography of Hamilton, because who else was going to do it, right? Jefferson had biographers, Madison had biographers, but who was going to save Hamilton's reputation? And so it's only relatively recently that we've begun to appreciate the role that they individually had. And they have a very unique relationship, the two of them. They were allies, they were good allies, but then they became political enemies. And they became enemies in a way that it never healed. Obviously, Hamilton died in 1804. But if you go to Montpelier, Madison's Montpelier now, you'll see it's sort of decorated in the style of the way the Madisons had it during his retirement years. And one of the things that Madison did was he would place on the wall pictures of people, even if he didn't agree with them, because they hosted so many visitors. People would come to call on the Madisons, and this would serve as a good conversation piece. So there would be a picture of John Adams on the wall, even though, Madison privately thought Adams was, a monarchist. But there were no pictures of Alexander Hamilton on the wall. And if you look even late in life, Madison had no regrets, at least as best I've been able to judge, about his relationship with Alexander Hamilton. And this despite the fact that in the 1780s, hardly anybody worked as hard as a team to bring about the Constitution into being than the two of them. So it's just really striking that their relationship turned so bitter and never recovered. Even when Hamilton died, it never recovered in Madison's memory. And one of the things so I've always been interested in that, and then one of the things that I find really interesting is how ultimately Madison capitulated to many of the points of disagreement he had with Hamilton. Madison opposed the Bank of the United States when it was offered by Hamilton in 1791, but in 1815 he charters the Second Bank of the United States. He opposes Hamilton's system of industrial protection when Hamilton proposes it in 1792. But the Tariff of 1815 was signed into law by Madison and was the first genuinely self-consciously protective tariff. So there's something about that that's interesting as well. And then the other thing that I find really interesting about the two of them is that many of the concerns that Madison had about Hamilton's economic agenda turned out not to be true in the 1790s. But if you look to the 1820s, the Second Bank of the United States was not well run, and it exhibited a lot of the problems that Madison had predicted would happen in the 1790s, originally about the First Bank. So there is something to be said, this idea that both of them were coming across something, that they were talking past one another, and think about it, but one of them being right, one of them being wrong is sort of to miss a bigger point, was sort of the inspiration for the book. And so what I end up arguing in the book is that our constitutional regime is premised on three values. There's a premise of liberalism, or the idea of a government that is limited in what it can do because one of its tasks is to secure natural rights. So a very Lockean kind of conception, particularly private property, which was widely viewed by the founders as being an essential right. But then there's other values as well. There's a value of republicanism, which is admittedly a nebulous concept. What is republicanism? But as is so often the case, I think Abraham Lincoln put it very succinctly and correctly when he said a republic is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So the Republican government is supposed to operate on behalf of the public good, but that it is also requires some level of public participation. And this is something that we take for granted today. But in the American context, they were radically Republican, because up to that point, England was seen as the model of how to manage a Republican government, where you have a popularly elected House of Commons balanced by a hereditary House of Lords and a hereditary king. And it was the Americans who did away with notions of hereditary rule in government, at least on a massive scale. So this sort of really radically Whiggish republicanism is another value. And then the third value is not itself a central tenet, but more of a practical one, and that is nationalism. Is that after the disaster of the 1780s, the nationalists decided, or most Americans decided, that the only way we're going to save this experiment in liberal republicanism is a stronger union. Uniting the people of the 13 states into a single American people, and also chartering a government that actually could exercise power. And that these three values are embedded in our preamble. Our preamble talks about protecting the blessings of liberty, Our preamble also opens with "We the people," which is a striking Republican statement. But then it says, "We the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union." So there's the nationalism as well. And the argument of my book is that these three principles or values don't necessarily line up with each other, parallel all the time. Sometimes they can come into conflict. And the argument that I make specifically with regards to Madison and Hamilton is that Hamilton's vision of economic nationalism interfered or violated in some important respects the common conceptions of republicanism, for which Madison was really the preeminent defender during the age. In particular, Hamilton's favoritism in his economic program, where all of his policies tended to favor the wealthy, particularly those who held public debt, tended to be very favorable to them, who tended to be a very narrow class of society at the time. Madison didn't think that was fair, that benefits of the government should be distributed more broadly. But moreover, Madison was worried that distributing benefits in such a one-sided fashion can be dangerous, because it's not a one-way street. If you give some private faction a benefit, you're giving them a source of revenue that can be turned into political power, which is what Madison worried about with the Bank of the United States. He said that the bank's owners, the stock owners, would become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tool and its tyrant, that there's a reciprocity there. And that ultimately both of them were right, that Hamilton was right that the government had to play favorites, at least in the short term, to get the American economy on a solid footing. But Madison was right that this was not consistent with our notions of fair play, and also endangered our conception of republicanism and led to, as the subtitle suggests, an oligarchy. So I also think, as a final point, I would just make one reference, even though the book is a book of history. I think it has, maybe it's too strong to say that it has policy implications for today. But I do think that it offers a way to think about policy problems today. And as a way to sort of get that point across, I would point out the similarities between the Bank of the United States and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They're very similar institutions. They're both what would be called government-sponsored enterprises. So they're private, for-profit enterprises that are owned and operated by their stockholders. However, they have a public charter. And they're given a public charter that includes implicit within it some sort of power or benefit or something that other corporations couldn't get. So the Second Bank of the United States had the power basically to hold treasury tax return, tax money in it. And similarly, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had certain benefits, advantages that they could take. They had basically an implicit guarantee that if they ever went belly up, the government would bail them out, which enabled them to sort of undercut the market. So both of theirs are sort of these mix of what in Hamilton called this a joint basis of public and private credit. He thought it was a good thing. And he was right, it was a good thing. But the lesson that I draw, the parallel between the Second Bank and Fannie and Freddie is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there was a dollar amount that existed as a consequence of their public charter. And they took just a tiny fraction of their public bounty and plowed it back into the political process so they could buy off members of Congress and administration figures and think tanks and all sorts of things to make sure that the government did not modify or alter the terms of their public subsidy. And that, I think, speaks to what Madison was worried about, that you can almost sort of see Fannie and Freddie as being a kind of Praetorian band. On the one hand, they're the tool of the government, the tool of federal housing policy, which is a very good thing. But on the other hand, they become the tyrant of the government, using a small fraction of its public benefits to drive the political process in ways that favored the stockholders of Fannie and Freddie rather than the public at large. So I think that ultimately, my book doesn't have any clear answers on who was right, who was wrong. So if you were coming looking for a final food fight on Team Hamilton or Team Madison, I don't have anything for you. And unfortunately, if you were coming to hear me belt out a show tune about James Madison, I don't have that either. But nevertheless, I think that the contest between Hamilton and Madison remains relevant in large part because it is a contest of big ideas that we all sort of share. and that we have to acknowledge that sometimes these ideas, they come from different traditions and they have different implications. So that was sort of, why ultimately the book is called The Price of Greatness, because I think ultimately it's just a price we have to pay. Thank you, everybody.
Look who showed up.
I have a story for you.
So we were going to do sort of a very informal kind of back and forth conversation. Steve and Luke are both sort of on the Hamiltonian end of the spectrum, whereas I am more on the Madisonian end. So, gentlemen, I am prepared to receive my rebuke from both of you now. Stephen, if you want to go first,
Sure.
offer comments, and we can just sort of have a freewheeling conversation.
Sure, sounds good. First of all, let me say that I think Jay's book is terrific. As a dyed-in-the-wool Hamiltonian, it's rare for me to find a book that clearly Jay has sympathies for Madison, but he doesn't take a hatchet to Hamilton. And as somebody who has written about Hamilton's image in the American mind, and trust me, for most of our history, up until Lin-Manuel Miranda made Hamilton a Broadway celebrity, Hamilton has not quite fit well. He was always portrayed, I think, successfully by the Jeffersonians as not quite one of us. This Caribbean immigrant who had sympathies for monarchy, which I don't think is true, but that was the label slapped on him. In many ways, throughout our history, Hamilton has been sort of airbrushed out of the story. Thankfully, he's back in vogue these days, which is good for people like me who write about Hamilton. But Jay doesn't fall into that trap. He treats Hamilton fairly. He takes Hamilton's principles seriously. He doesn't always assume the worst in terms of Hamilton's motives. And that was so refreshing to read. So I wanted to state that up front. In my view, part of the reason Hamilton has never quite, up until recently, received his due is I think people misunderstood his nationalism. Everything Hamilton devoted himself to from at least 1780 onward was to, as he put it, to convince his fellow citizens to think continentally, to think beyond the fact that they were Virginians or New Yorkers or whatever, and to begin to consider themselves citizens of the United States of America. And he had a very formidable partner at his side. A partner's not the right word. George Washington shared the same perspective. Both men, of course, had fought in the Revolutionary War. Hamilton at Washington's side throughout much of that conflict. And I think that experience of literally sort of tromping up and down the Atlantic seaboard and taking on the world's greatest superpower convinced these men to think of themselves as Americans. It was an easier task for Hamilton because he, of course, had been born in the Caribbean and didn't identify with the state. But George Washington did, of course, identify with Virginia, but over time begins to think of himself as an American. So everything that both Washington and Hamilton were about during the post-war years and then into the first presidency under the Constitution were designed to convince their fellow citizens to think continentally. So the bank, the assumption of the state and Articles of Confederation debts by the new government, even things as relatively innocuous as the Thanksgiving Day proclamation that Washington issued, where he sort of circumvented the state governors, beat them to the punch, and it pitches the Thanksgiving proclamation to the citizens of the United States of America. All of their efforts were designed to, again, not to beat a dead horse, to convince Americans to think continentally. And I think in the minds of some, particularly Hamilton's opponents, they saw this as an attempt to move the United States or move the spirit of 1776 away from its true principles and create another distant central government that would be detached from the people and create a kind of moneyed elite that would not be sympathetic to the toiling farmers in the hinterlands. Again, Hamilton was a believer in republicanism, in liberal republicanism, but most of his emphasis is on nationalism, on building this American identity. And as Jay, I think, really adroitly points out in his book, those are not always an easy fit. So I just wanted to open with that.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out. It's really awful the way the Jeffersonians caricaturized Hamilton. I mean, really, Madison in particular, because he knew better.
Yeah.
Madison knew the man. Jefferson had been in France and so could be forgiven for maybe to some extent. But because what they did, it's not just that we can have sort of they could have in theory had a dry policy debate about, the negative externalities of economic nationalism, right? But that's not what they did. They said Hamilton Jefferson wrote in his diary that Hamilton was out to form a monarchy bottomed on corruption, and they were convinced that he was lining his own pockets. And as a matter of fact, Madison and Jefferson encouraged William Branch Giles, who was a congressman from Virginia, maybe a senator, I don't remember, to basically trump up these charges to embarrass Hamilton and force him out of office. But in fact, Hamilton, by the time he left the Treasury Department, was broke. He had never made a dishonest dollar from politics. And I think that if there is any sort of personal failing that Hamilton made that I discuss in this book, because obviously his private life with Maria was very dicey and he did not treat her very well. But Hamilton he didn't have a good judgment when it came to his friends. So Hamilton ends up putting together an economic package that is very nationalistic and very far-sighted. But all these people around him are watching him as he's writing it. And then they basically, there's this massive insider trading that's happening just because Hamilton's kind of a blabbermouth, right? And it happens again and again. As a matter of fact, Hamilton's first assistant secretary, William Dewar, while he's helping Hamilton create this economic plan, he's simultaneously working with one of the partners of Gouverneur and Robert Morris, a business partner, to form an international banking syndicate that's basically premised on their inside information. And Dewar ends up in jail, in debtor's prison during in the aftermath of the Panic of 1792. And that was something where Madison should have known better about Hamilton because the two of them had worked together so closely. Madison should have known that Hamilton was a good man and he was an honest Republican. And I think that Hamilton's politics were on the elite side and probably too elite for the spirit of the age. But so was John Adams's. And Madison had, like I said, Madison had a picture of John Adams up in his parlor. And I think it's really a black mark against Madison, especially.
Just a couple of quick things. Jay's absolutely right. It's unfortunate that the battles during the 1790s became so personal. I've often argued, and I don't know how this will go down with some of you folks, that Hamilton was the first American victim of the politics of personal destruction. That story about the extramarital affair that he had with Maria Reynolds, of course, was leaked to James Callender, who was on Jefferson's payroll. Callender, of course, would later turn around and reveal the Sally Hemings story. Anyways, there is justice in the world.
And in fact, it was so bitter that when James Monroe, at the end of his presidential administration in 1825, comes to call on Eliza Hamilton, as in like, let's bury the hatchet, she refuses to even receive him because Monroe was involved in the leaking of the Maria Reynolds scandal. Very, very nasty. She wasn't wrong either. I mean, you see that story, you don't feel bad for James Monroe. You feel bad for Eliza Hamilton, that her husband's name was dragged through the mud like that.
The only other thing I might add, Jay used the word elitist or elitism when it comes to Hamilton, and it is absolutely true that Hamilton considered it vital to get wealthy American interests on the side of this, to be linked, to be bound to this new Constitution. No question. I would urge you to think about, when I hear that term elitist, I cringe a little bit only because, and you you alluded to this, Jay. The Federalists had a far better, including Hamilton, a far better track record in terms of the issue of slavery.
Yes.
And in terms of free blacks being allowed to vote in the North.
And women as well.
And women as well. It's the Republicans starting under Jefferson, not necessarily directed by President Jefferson, but certainly accelerating during the presidencies of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, that begins to disenfranchise at the state level free blacks in the North. So I always get my back up a little bit when I hear that term, because people like John Jay, even Hamilton, a founder of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, Timothy Pickering, some of these well-known Federalists who are typically referred to as elitists have a much better track record on matters of race than Jefferson or Madison, for that matter.
That's a good point. Luke.
So thank you, everyone. I apologize for being tardy. I had the delightful experience of being stuck behind a motorcade in a taxi and then having that taxi break down under Thomas Circle. So sprinting here from Thomas Circle, the capital of the extended republic never felt so extended. Let me tell you, if you've never run in July in Washington in wool, don't. There's something fitting about breaking down under Thomas Circle, though, of course, because the statue, the equestrian statue at the top, is of Winfield Scott, hero of the Mexican War, greatest military mind ever produced by the United States, and I will fight anyone who disputes that with me. And Winfield Scott, of course, was the architect of the great imperial campaign that doubled the size of the United States even after the Louisiana Purchase. And if ever the Republic were to be extended into an imperial republic, it would be Winfield Scott who effectuated that extension. And so, as I was running, sweating heavily, panting, regretting every poor life choice I've ever made, down Massachusetts Avenue, I was put in mind that really, in many respects, while the personal and the historical detail around the dispute between Madison and Hamilton energizes a lot of your book and makes it such a wonderful read for non-specialists, you and I get to debate history every week on our podcast, and I want to argue with you now about political philosophy, which is to say that the challenge presented by nationalism, and both Hamilton and Madison are robust nationalists, is the question of how to combine a continental scope with Republican energy. Because, of course, within the traditional theory of political systems, republics were known to capture the loyalties and the energies of their citizens, but to thus be extremely fractious and prone to internal division. And it's Madison's great genius to see the extended republic and the pitting of ambition against ambition as a solution to the problem of faction. But both Madison and Hamilton recognize that in extending the republic, you vitiate some of the neighborly affection that motivates citizenship, and that you will have a problem of loyalty, not simply a problem of imposing the will of the center, but also of commanding the affections of the citizenry. And I would suggest that the solutions they reach for re-energizing the affections of American citizens for their soon-to-be continent-expanding republic has a lot to do with their dispute. And so while the personalities obviously matter, and both of them had personalities that were probably combustible, and while their broader ideas about which faction they support and policy matter as well, and I don't want to downplay those, I think what you bring up in the book, and what I'd like to elaborate on here, is how they viewed demanding the loyalty of the citizens of the United States differently. Madison, in some respects, gets boxed in with the Bill of Rights, which he winds up authoring, its various parts, but in many respects, that, as a lived experience day to day, makes the American citizen experience the American Republic as if it were still a small republic. One can read the Bill of Rights as a series of new institutional creations, the jury, the militia, the newspaper, the church, that allow neighbors to protect neighbors from an overarching federal government. I don't want to overdo it and say that there's a kind of militia bicameralism with the standing army, but one can see that these are institutions more than positive rights. These are means by which neighbors can be on one another's side in cases of injustice or in exceptional circumstances. And so, in many ways, the job is done for Madison when he takes on his role in writing the Bill of Rights and also as a leader in Congress during the first and second Congress, et cetera. But for Hamilton, I think his theory of loyalty and how to make Americans loyal to their their state, their distant state, moving to Washington, D.C. In July. It was hot then, too. Is less obvious. And it's Hamilton who really comes up with this notion of a bureaucracy that both serves and taxes the citizens in an immediate way, right? And it's Hamilton who sees that in order for a state to command the loyalties of its subjects, it must demand things of them and offer things to them. And I was wondering if I could just put on you an elaboration of the ways in which there are different views of how to command loyalty, how to re-enliven the experience of being a citizen in a small republic, leads to this unraveling, this conflict, and ultimately, in many respects, the fight that splits the Federalists off from the Republicans, kills the Federalists, and then leads to the era of good feelings.
Yeah, that's all I have to do.
That's it.
Oh,
hey, I ran 4 blocks.
that's true. You
weather.
did remarkably well, considering the duress that you were under. Yeah, no, I think there's, it's interesting because I think that, and we've talked about this before, and I discuss this in my book that one of after the War of 1812, the typical narrative is that Madison capitulates to Hamiltonianism, right? That the Second Bank of the United States ends up being, waving the white flag and admitting that Hamilton was right. And to a large extent, that's a true statement, but it's an incomplete statement. Because what Madison and his fellow Republicans do is they broaden the base, is what they do. And so I would point out that the first Bank of the United States, Hamilton didn't really want bank branches. And I think that by the time Jefferson becomes president, I think there's 6. There's 6 bank branches. And so it's like in New York and Philadelphia and Savannah, Georgia and Boston, pretty much along the eastern seaboard. But when the second bank is chartered, it opens with 18 branches, and it expands to 24 branches. Now, and that might not seem meaningful to us today because there's banks everywhere now. But this is a period before there was anything resembling a good financial institution, network of financial institutions. It's easy to take this for granted. And what the second bank ends up doing through its branches is providing a reliable financial foundation, particularly in the South and the West. So that ironically, when Jackson, who's a Democrat, and his coalition is built primarily on the South and the West, when he vetoes the Second Bank of the United States, the bill to recharter in 1832, he's doing it over the votes of his own coalition. And that is actually the Northeasterners who were most opposed to the bank, particularly New York State, Martin Van Buren's political machine, because New York had a very elaborate...
Sorry, I'm an idiot.
You need to New York had a very... this is a great argument for Madisonianism, by the way.
It is.
See, the Madisonian is here on time. He turns his phone off. Anyway.
The 30 minutes before I got here felt a little bit like the last year of Hamilton's life.
Right.
Everything went wrong.
But so what Madison ends up doing and what his political sort of successors do is they expand the reach of the benefits that Hamilton's system provides. They also do this in the case of, say, emphasizing internal improvements. Internal improvements, federal sponsorship of internal improvements, is a way for people in remote areas to feel like they're directly gaining something from the government. And this is where Hamilton, I think, did not have, I think you're right in principle, but Hamilton was, too often Hamilton argued to his fellow Americans that you're going to receive benefits from this program somewhere down the line. So that from a lived experience, your experience with the Washington administration, you would not be deriving primary benefits from the Bank of the United States. But you did have to pay the excise tax on whiskey. And if you lived in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, and there weren't good roads, it made economic sense to turn your grain into whiskey because you could sell it better. And so Hamilton was basically putting a tax on their cash crop, so to speak. And I think that's one reason why that Madison and Clay, Henry Clay as well, and John C. Calhoun in his nationalist phase, were able to put together a policy package that really leads to a decade or more of political, at least domestic calm, putting aside the issue of slavery, which is independent of these economic disputes, obviously with Missouri's request to become a state and the resulting Missouri Compromise. But there wasn't really a lot of political policy space on domestic matters of economics and taxes and things like that for 5 or 6 years after Madison left office. And juxtaposed to that, when Hamilton proposes these policies, he really creates a political firestorm. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing the research on Madison in the 1790s is that if Hamilton had just spread the benefits a little bit broader, he probably could have gotten rid of Madison's opposition altogether, but probably would have softened it a little bit. I think a great illustration of Hamilton's problem is that if you read the report on manufacturers, Hamilton is sort of making this really far-sighted argument for the necessity to develop American industrialism. But he spends most of his time trying to convince the farmers that they should go along with this, right? That the farmers should pay higher taxes in the short run. But, when the Republicans in 1815 put together a protective tariff, they put a tariff on the wool to protect the wool industry. So the farmers get something too. See, that was sort of the difference. It's sort of Madison, and it's something, he's never going to get a statue built in his honor for this. But James Madison is really the father of the American congressional log roll. Really was. And the impost of 1783 was basically a log roll. It was his idea. And the reason we still use log rolls is that they make a lot of political sense. It's a way to make enough people happy, which in a democratic society, you kind of need to do.
Just to add to that, I would mention that there's no doubt in my mind that both James Madison and particularly Thomas Jefferson were far more adept at politics than Alexander Hamilton. I can sit up here and sing Hamilton's praises to the sky, and I've done that before. But he was routinely, he and the Federalists were routinely outmaneuvered by the party of Jefferson and Madison.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I think for that is that Jefferson and Madison had really cut their teeth in the 1770s and 1780s dealing with Patrick Henry.
Yeah.
And you look at the sort of fights that there's this great line that, when we think of the Founding Fathers as being all, singing in harmony with each other or whatever, it's not true. There's this great line that Jefferson wrote to Madison about Henry in the middle of the 1780s where he says, I think now we have to pray fervently for his death. Right? This is what Jefferson said about Patrick Henry. They hated each other. But there was also a really, it was the Virginians, and Stephen, you're absolutely right about the Federalists having a more expansive notion of what citizenship could be. The Southerners, the Southern Republicans had a more restrictive notion of who qualified as a citizen. But within the sphere of this is the category of people who are citizens. If you think of the Federalist sphere being larger than the Republican. The people who qualified as citizens under the Republican definition had a lot more leeway and opportunities for politicking than existed in Federalist sort of politics. And so the Federalist politics ends up being sort of somewhat patrician. And like Gouverneur Morris at the Constitutional Convention says, I'm not here representing New York or Pennsylvania. I'm here representing the world, right? Which is all well and good, but James Madison had to take the thing back to Virginia, and he knew Patrick Henry was just chomping at the bit. So there is something about the politics of colonial Virginia and Virginia in its early state period that prepared them in a way that I don't think Hamilton was ready for.
Yeah.
So actually, building on that, the great unfortunate thing about Hamilton, of course, is he dies. Happens with alarming regularity. But, he dies early on, and he dies at a time when it's still pretty clear that the question of American sovereignty is still an open one, right? And all the way through the War of 1812, you could contend maybe, but you could contend that the question of the survival of the Republic is an open question. And it would seem to me that as time progresses, the Jeffersonians become more agrarian, more sort of little r Republican, more inclined to engage in what we might call populism today, and that federalism insofar as it can be described beyond a style, not simply as a set of policies and not simply as a kind of like tone. We talk about high-tone federalism, but as a style of a patrician style of doing politics, becomes less essential as American sovereignty becomes more assured, because Hamilton, of course, as we know, is dealing with this problem of a disloyal aristocracy, and he's trying to solve it, right? These people are in a revolutionary state where their wealth may in fact be better preserved if they betray the Republic and, help Britain come back in and take things over. And now, granted, they've seen a whole bunch of very wealthy people get sent to Nova Scotia, which no one wants to do. But is it not the case that, well, let me put it to you this way. I'll ask a hypothetical question about a history that doesn't exist. Had Hamilton lived, had Aaron Burr not shot him down, is it reasonable to assume that his politics might have become less patrician as the question of keeping the rich on board with the Republican project became less urgent? Or was there something constitutive in Hamilton that made him side with the wealthy such that even as the geostrategic question moved to the back of the line, he would most likely have still continued to be an advocate on the part of the rich? And I don't just mean on the part of trade or finance, but on the part of the rich.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, Hamilton himself was not rich, right? Hamilton married very well. His wife Eliza was a Schuyler, and the Schuylers were a very prominent family. Philip Schuyler was a senator from New York. And Hamilton had, I think, an undue sense of, I don't want to psychoanalyze a man who's been dead for over 200 years, but he seems places an awful lot of faith in the goodwill of the wealthy. I'll just say that. Why, I don't know, but and you see this manifested in his bad choice of friends, right? Which was really regrettable. A lot of his friends were just bad. Very similar to Ulysses S. Grant, actually. If you look at Grant as president and the sort of kind of the scumbags that end up sort of like barnacles on the SS Grant, sort of similar to Hamilton's operation. Whether or not that would have manifested itself, over time, I don't know. I think that Hamilton, I'll say this, with regards to his attitude towards, say, maybe as sort of a test case, we can't know for sure. But one of the things that happened, the wealthy in the middle of the 1790s did not want to go to war with Great Britain because they were making money off of the trade with Great Britain, and they were prepared to basically sign whatever the British wanted. And Hamilton ends up being sort of the main agent encouraging John Jay to write the Jay Treaty, which was a very generous treaty. But at one point during the lead up to that treaty, Hamilton reads the British minister George Hammond the Riot Act over the way Americans were being treated on the high seas. And he encourages George Washington, to start thinking about asking Congress for appropriations to start to build the army back up, that we have to be ready. And I think that speaks to that, if the chips were down, like for instance in the War of 1812, I think that Hamilton, and I don't want to say where he would have landed on that, obviously, because who knows, but there was sort of this element in New England that put this economic interest of the section over the interest of the whole nation. And I don't think Hamilton ever was like that. I don't think. So that's a good question. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. So I think we're ready to do some Q&A, and we have some microphones circling around. So just, if you want to ask us a question, could be about anything if you want. How good's my jump shot? It's not very good.
Dirty jokes also accepted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Luke Phillips, unemployed. So I am interested in what both the Madisonian and Hamiltonian sides think of this. When you talk about Hamilton as ushering in a new era of new economic systems and a new political loyalties, I can picture people in Silicon Valley seeing themselves in that kind of role. We're building a new world that is more interconnected economically, different kinds of economic stuff that disrupts everything, and a new kind of political loyalty to mankind, loyalty to the globe, all that kind of thing. And so my question, especially to you, Dr. Knott, but to everybody on the panel, is to what degree would Silicon Valley kind of tech workers be justified in seeing themselves philosophically and politically and historically as neo-Hamiltonians of a sort?
Wow. I'm not sure I can give you an appropriate answer. I would say this, and this is not going to come as a surprise to if you've read my book, as you have. I mean, I do see Hamilton as the founding father of American capitalism, which is part of the reason he's been despised by folks, particularly on the left, even to this day. You'll see him referred to as the founding plutocrat. Hamilton would be thrilled with something like a Silicon Valley. He would be thrilled to come back, I think, and see Wall Street, where he used to work. He would be thrilled to some extent to see the Pentagon across the river here. What he would not be thrilled about, and I'm not saying this just because I'm at the American Enterprise Institute, I don't see him as the father of the modern administrative state. I don't see him as the father of the welfare state. Anybody who can write that the power over a man's subsistence is the power over a man's will, I think would be a little bit uncomfortable with a lot of the New Deal and Great Society programs. And I would urge you to take a look at the work of Carson Holloway, a professor at, I think, the University of Omaha, who's done great work on this issue. But overall, I think Hamilton would be extremely proud of the fact that the United States is the world's greatest economic power. He wrote explicitly about seeing the day when that would occur, when the United States would surpass the great powers of Europe, and it happened remarkably quickly. I think by the 1890s, the United States had the largest economy in the world. So 100 years after Hamilton's economic blueprint was laid down, his vision was achieved.
I would add to that I think that Hamilton had a love for America that is really the kind of love that probably only immigrants can really genuinely feel. Like, he actually kind of, like, if you were born in America, you've always known America. It's different. And, like, Hamilton fell in love with America. And you can see this especially in his early Federalist essays, it runs all through. Hamilton's writing is a very impassioned, polemical form of writing. But his early Federalist essays particularly have this sort of anxiety to them that we're spoiling this chance, the first chance in human civilization to pull off something like this. We're in the process of ruining it, and it's not in some sort of abstract kind of sense, where we've thrown off the shackles of the British tyrants, but he thought that the American people were an enormously intrepid, inventive, ingenious, courageous, virtuous, those sorts of the war propaganda from World War II. If you've ever seen the Westinghouse picture of the woman holding up her arm saying, "We can do it," that was Hamilton's attitude about his fellow Americans, really in a nutshell. So I think he probably would look at something like Silicon Valley and said, "Of course we invented that. We're America. That's what we do." So yeah, I think he would be very proud.
But I would push back on one element of that, which is that the Silicon Valley aspiration to universalism, I think, would chafe with Hamilton. He was very aware that we were building both an economic and political project, but also a cultural one. There's a letter, I think, to Rush where he says, we're endeavoring to do something less and less Greek or English and more truly American. And in the early Federalist essays, when he talks about the American project as something with universal aspects, he describes it as of, quote, interest to the whole world, right? It's not just appealing or philosophically important or morally sound, it's of interest. And so insofar as the kind of culture of Silicon Valley, if it can be called that, yogurt has culture, I guess it does, it's notions of sort of deracinated, delocalized monads bouncing around with no affections for particular communities, I think would strike him as really ridiculous.
And dangerous, too,
and
in the long run.
Yeah. That's fair.
Hi, my name is Nicole Penn. I'm the research assistant here for Dr. Lynn B. Cheney, so we're operating in the same world. So, she wrote a good biography of Madison a few years back. So I'm wondering, how does Jefferson's concept of the natural aristocracy influence Madison's conceptions of oligarchy? Is this something that you've seen in your research influence Madison in any way, or elucidate a little bit on some Jeffersonian concepts of oligarchy?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the founders believed in something that you would call natural aristocracy, right? And I actually don't think it's all that controversial an idea. It's just sort of the idea of some people are smarter than others, and some people are harder workers than others. And some people wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they've done more than you're going to do in a whole day before you even wake up. I mean, I don't think there's any. I think one of the differences is it becomes controversial when we start racializing that, right? That's where we get ourselves into this, things that views we no longer hold. And obviously, you can't, when you're talking about Madison and Jefferson and the sort of ideas of natural aristocracy, they're inevitably going to have a racial element to them, which is, sort of creates an unfortunate. It makes it difficult to sort of, you sort of have to kind of take these sorts of strands and separate them and then look at them on their own, which is an unfortunate task. But I do think that, so what would the difference be? Well, I think one of the differences is that they had an Old Testament view of money making, right? Where, the idea where we sort of view, interest as like financial interest, like you put your money in the bank and it makes interest, this is a good thing. They thought that this was a dangerous thing, right? And so that for them, there's this constant, like Madison, what we would call today investors. Madison, and I've read so much Madison that I've ended up taking up some of this rhetoric, but he would call them speculators, or he would call them stock jobbers. So it's sort of like, just basically people who are, day traders. He would call them stock jobbers, right? So, and there's an idea that they're making their money independent of the virtuous, manly, Republican ways that money should be made, which is primarily, owning land.
Ironic for a bunch of slaveholders. But.
Ironic, indeed. Very, very ironic for a bunch of slaveholders, right? But there's an interesting letter that Light Horse Harry Lee wrote to Madison, and Harry Lee was the father, actually, of Robert E. Lee, during the Panic of 1792. When subscriptions were open to the Bank of the United States, there was this real frenzy, which of course there would have been because it was basically a guaranteed moneymaker. It was a can't-miss opportunity, and people went nuts for this. And what happened is that the price of the bank scrip would cost you $100, right, to buy it directly from the government. But this secondary market opened up where the price kept going up and up and up. It eventually created a bubble, right? But the Republicans, who were the Virginians at this point, looked at this and they were aghast. So Henry Lee writes this letter to Madison saying, on my way up to New York, I saw everybody was obsessed with jobbing, that they weren't working, and he even has this line, the fairer sex had been neglected, all this stuff. It's sort of like this idea of money-making undermining virtue and genuine hard work. So that would be one of the sort of the differences, I would say, between and there's very almost kind of, it's one of the challenges of sort of updating Madison. Right? A lot of times they say, well, the Founding Fathers bequeathed us this free market system. It's like, well, Madison was actually kind of a physiocrat. His idea of economic value was pretty much tied up into the land, which isn't to say like Jefferson had very little conception of finance. Madison had, and had actually dealt with matters of public finance, but still did not have looked at what was happening in the sort of the commercial class as being greedy. Even when the embargo during the end of Jefferson's second term basically falls into tatters. In retirement, Madison is reminiscing and saying, we could have made that work if it wasn't for the greedy merchants who engaged in this black market stuff, right? Basically skirting the laws of the embargo, right? So he had this sort of definition of capitalism would have been almost kind of a dirty word for him, I would say, in some respects. I don't know if that answers your question.
and he's not crazy to think that way either, right? I mean, it's worth keeping in mind that The Wealth of Nations comes out in 1776. There's a sea change that it brings about in the way people think about national finance and the national fisc. But what Madison is thinking is it's not an example of him being somehow limited as an intellect. He's working within the set of economic concepts that are the sort of common parlance of his age.
That's right. And I would add to that, too, that Madison is, this is like right before the Industrial Revolution, right? So if you can imagine, the standard of living in the world had basically been like this until about 1850 when it goes like this. So how are you going to, so from Madison's viewpoint, Madison has views that are, sort of like, well, we have to remain in agriculture because sooner or later Europe is going to run out of, they're going to have too many people, they're not going to be able to feed all their people, and that's one of the advantages that we have. So this idea that we take for granted today of sort of like capital and industry and investing and economic growth and technological development, all of this stuff was really foreign. And it was really just beginning to start. Even the cotton gin wasn't even invented until, I think, 1798 or something like that. The railroad isn't invented yet. These are all the sorts of things that we take for granted about economic growth. And this is one of the things where if we credit Hamilton for being so far-sighted in his economic vision, it's really not entirely fair of us to be critical of Madison, because Madison just saw what pretty much everybody else saw. It was Hamilton who somehow saw beyond that and could see opportunities that were not obvious, I would say. It was something to bear in mind.
If I could just add, in terms of the National Bank and speculation and all of the sort of frenzied economic activity Hamilton's policies unleashed, it's really important to remember, in Hamilton's view, the National Bank was an element of American national security.
Yes.
So what he's attempting to do is to create an institution that will be able, sometimes perhaps on short notice, to fund the American military. And so Hamilton, had he lived long enough to see the embargo and then the disastrous War of 1812, would have said, I told you, you can't, there are no alternatives to the use of conventional force. At some point, as a nation state, we're going to have an army and a navy to defend ourselves against the old world powers. And the National Bank was one element in that sort of national security plan of Hamilton. So please, keep that in mind when you think of the bank and some of the downsides.
Yeah, not only that, but when the absence of the bank, because the bank charter expires in 1811, and during the War of 1812, Albert Gallatin struggled to borrow money because one of the challenges that Gallatin faced was the war was popular in the South and the West, but most of the hard currency was actually in the Northeast, which opposed the war. So that this is the disaster. Well, I should say the near disaster that was the War of 1812, and hat tip to Commodore Perry and General Jackson for really preventing us from losing territory in that war. But the near disaster was in a lot of respects because the country had been governing for 15 years at that point without fully appreciating what Hamilton had done for them.
And for Madison, mobilizing an army, both in terms of avoiding European intervention and also mobilizing an army, is really a question of arable acreage, right? For Madison, he thinks, well, the English aren't going to invade us again, or the British aren't going to invade us again because they need our food. So because they need our food, we can prevent a war from happening, and he seems to miss the extent to which, and Hamilton's right about this, a short-term war can renegotiate the sort of balance of powers, and then your arable food won't, or your arable acreage won't prevent that from happening.
Exactly.
But it's not, again, it's not crazy for him to think in those terms.
Horace MacDonald had a great line about Madison and Jefferson's sort of attempts to use economic warfare to keep the United States from being entangled in these perpetual conflicts between England and France. He said that the embargo, Jefferson's embargo, was like a flea threatening to commit suicide in order to stop a dogfight. We being the flea, of course.
We being the flea, the United States being the flea. Are we have? Okay, we're out of time. Okay, thank you very much for coming, everybody. You've been a great audience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.